In deep Appalachia, Halloween night comes with rules. I've lived my entire life in a holler on the outskirts of Wyoming County, West Virginia, a place so remote it barely registers on a map. Just a handful of families in dense, unforgiving woods pressing in on all sides. This place doesn't have neighborhoods, doesn't have sidewalks, and most definitely does not have trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Halloween isn't a holiday here, it's a test of survival. My family and the others who've clung to these hills long enough to know follow a strict set of rules on Halloween night. It's not tradition, not superstition, it's survival. Those who didn't follow the rules, well, they didn't live long enough to tell anyone about it. The stories of their disappearances are woven into the fabric of these mountains, whispered warnings passed down through generations. These rules aren't just about keeping doors locked or avoiding dark places. They're specific, arcane, with reasons rooted in events we don't talk about. Events that claw at the edges of my dreams, leaving me gasping for breath in the dead of night. My dad always said they came from my great-grandmother's time, when people came to these mountains from Scotland, bringing with them the old ways, a knowledge of things best left undisturbed, spirits, creatures, entities too old to name. Whatever lurks in the shadows, Halloween night here has always been a game of life and death, and each rule existed to give you just enough of an edge to make it through till morning. The first time I broke a rule, I learned why they exist, and I'll never forget the chilling wail that still echoes in my nightmares. Every October, around the second week, the rules went up on the fridge, handwritten on yellowed paper. The ink faded, but the meaning stark. We lived by them. My family took them seriously, not just in a keep the kids safe kind of way. Number these rules were for everyone. Break one, and you'd put us all in danger. If you hear 3 knocks at the door after sunset, do not answer. If you hear a single hard knock, open the door, but do not look at who stands there. Hold out a basket of freshly baked bread and wait until you hear the footsteps leaving to shut the door. If you hear someone call your name from the woods, do not answer, no matter how familiar the voice. If you see a figure at the tree line wearing a wide-brimmed hat, do not look at him for longer than 1 second. Do not acknowledge his presence. If you hear chains dragging on the ground, sprinkle salt on all windowsills and door thresholds within 1 minute. If a candle is burning in the window of the old abandoned Anderson cabin up the hill, stay indoors, no matter what. These rules weren't arbitrary. They were written in blood. People vanished, people died, and strange, unexplainable things occurred. That's just how it was, how it always had been. The mountains remember. Halloween a few years ago fell on a full moon. The air crackled with a strange energy, a palpable sense of dread. My dad, his face etched with worry lines deeper than I'd ever seen, had that look in his eyes, the one that said things were going to be bad. You could feel it in the holler, thick and suffocating, like something breathing down your neck. "Salt the windows now," he instructed, his voice tight. "We're not waiting for the chains." My hands trembled as I poured the salt, a thin white line against the dark wood, a fragile barrier against the unknown. My brother Isaac was already baking the bread, his face pale, his movements jerky. Rule number 2. The one we hated the most. It was the one that forced us to interact, to acknowledge the things that lurked just beyond our door. We never knew who or what it was, but we knew if you didn't offer the bread, if you dared to look, it wouldn't be good. By late afternoon, the house was fortified. The aroma of warm bread filled the air, a small comfort against the growing darkness. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Dad sat by the door, a 12 gauge across his lap. Isaac, younger and more fearful, kept glancing nervously at the window. 3 hours until sunset. The rules were clear. Everything bad happened after dark. But the waiting was the worst part, the slow creep of dread tightening its grip around our hearts. "Did we use enough salt?" Isaac whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Dad didn't answer. He just stared into the flames, his grip tightening on the shotgun. That was answer enough. The first knock came just after dark, single, slow, deliberate. Isaac and I froze, every muscle tense. Dad stood, his face grim, motioning for us to stay back. "Don't look," he murmured, his voice low and steady. He opened the door a crack, just enough to slip the basket through. His eyes were fixed on the floor, but I saw it, a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. A shadow stretching across the porch, impossibly long and distorted. I quickly averted my gaze, my heart hammering against my ribs. A faint shuffling sound, then the slow, heavy retreat of footsteps. Dad closed and locked the door, his hands shaking. "Why don't we just leave the bread out early?" Isaac asked, his voice trembling. "Why wait?" "We have to wait," Dad said, his voice strained. "And if we don't answer, it'll come in." We thought it was over. We'd followed Rule 2. But here in this hollow, nothing stays quiet for long on Halloween. Isaac saw him first, standing at the edge of the woods just where the trees met the clearing, a tall, gaunt figure in a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face in shadow. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there watching. "It's him," Isaac whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't look," Dad snapped. "Not for more than a second." I glanced, just a fleeting glimpse, enough to see the unnatural stillness of the figure, the way it seemed to melt into the shadows, enough to send a shiver of pure ice down my spine. I quickly looked away. We retreated from the windows, huddling around the fire, the flames our only solace against the encroaching darkness. Outside, the figure remained, a silent sentinel at the edge of the woods. Then after midnight, we heard the chains, a faint metallic clinking at first, growing louder, closer, scraping against the rocky ground outside. "The salt!" Isaac breathed, his face ashen. Dad nodded grimly. "Go check." My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, circling the house, inspecting the salt lines. Intact, undisturbed. The chains dragged closer, the sound grating against my nerves. But we stayed inside, huddled together, listening to the relentless scraping until the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows. The figure was gone. The chains were silent. But as the light grew stronger, I saw it. A single candle flickering in the window of the old Anderson cabin up the hill. My blood ran cold. The rules. Stay inside. Even with the sun rising, the sight of that candle filled me with a primal terror. We were trapped. Last year was different. The air hung heavy with a malevolence I'd never felt before. Even the rules felt flimsy, inadequate. Dad was getting older, slower. We both knew it, but we didn't speak of it. We just clung to the rules, hoping, praying they would be enough. The knock came, single, sharp, insistent. Dad stood picking up the basket, his hands trembling. "Stay put," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He opened the door, and then the bread slipped, the basket tipped, the bread tumbled out onto the porch. And I looked. It wasn't human, not entirely. Too tall, its limbs elongated and grotesquely thin, its skin stretched taut over jutting bones. Its face, a skull barely covered by a thin layer of pallid flesh, and its eyes, wide, vacant, devoid of pupils, reflecting the flickering candlelight from the Anderson cabin. Its mouth opened, an impossibly wide black chasm, and a sound erupted, a deafening, guttural wail that scraped against my eardrums, a sound that belonged in nightmares. It lunged. A skeletal hand shot out, seizing Dad by the throat. He didn't even have time to scream. It dragged him off the porch, his body scraping against the rocks, his muffled cries swallowed by the creature's horrific wail. Isaac screamed. I froze, paralyzed by terror. Then the candle, the Anderson cabin, burning bright. We'd broken the final rule. The cabin door flew open as if something within had been awakened by our transgression. Something furious. I grabbed Isaac, pulling him back inside. "We have to go," I screamed, slamming the door shut, fumbling with the lock, the chains dragging across the porch. We'd forgotten to re-salt the threshold after going outside. The door creaked, a heavy weight pressing against it. We ran, barricading ourselves in the back bedroom, Salt poured frantically against the door. The chains rattled through the house. Dad, he was gone. And then, the knocking. Not the single knock, not 3 knocks. A frantic pounding, desperate, enraged. The rules didn't cover this. We huddled together, the shotgun useless in our trembling hands. We waited, and we prayed for dawn. The pounding continued, relentless. The chains dragged back and forth. The candle in the Anderson cabin burned bright, a beacon of death. When the first light finally broke, the sound stopped. The candle flickered and died. We survived. But Dad, he never came back. Halloween in our holler has always been a test, but last year it took something from us, something precious. And the rules? I fear they're not enough anymore. The woods whisper his name, and I know with a chilling certainty that this Halloween will be worse. I'll tell you a terrifying story that happened on Halloween. It's a true story, or so they say, and it made my hair stand on end when I heard it. This all took place years ago in my town, which back then was just a small village nestled in the mountains of Catalonia, Spain. The town consisted of little more than a square, with a church, a park, a jail, and a school, with the houses clustered around them. The town was incredibly proud of its school, considered the best in the province. It was the morning of October 31st, Halloween Day. In a crowded classroom, a group of students were busy making crafts. Some cut skeleton shapes from paper, others drew vampire bats, and some painted pumpkins. The children were all around 8 or 9 years old. Their teacher, a beautiful young woman, had only been working at the school for a month. As the kids happily prepared their Halloween decorations, the teacher switched on the radio to catch the weather forecast. She planned an outdoor Halloween party for them later that day and wanted to make sure it wouldn't rain. Suddenly, the weather report was interrupted by a news bulletin. This is an important announcement. A convicted murderer has escaped from the local prison. He is considered armed and dangerous. Do not approach him. The police will... The teacher rushed across the room to turn off the radio, not wanting to panic the children, but it was likely too late. They'd heard the broadcast and were terrified. They knew the prison was close to the school. The teacher tried to reassure them, telling them not to worry. Minutes later, the principal's voice boomed over the intercom. Attention all teachers. We've been notified that the police are responding to a serious situation in town. All teachers are advised to lock their classroom doors and windows until the police have the situation under control. I repeat, lock all doors and windows until further notice. The teacher, trying to keep the class calm, locked the door and secured all the windows, ensuring they were tightly shut. A little girl raised her hand and asked to go to the bathroom. The teacher hesitated, but the girl insisted she couldn't wait. Relenting, the teacher figured it was unlikely the escaped convict would target the school. She told the girl to knock on the door with a special code when she returned. 3 knocks and 2 scratches, so they'd know it was her. The little girl left for the bathroom, and the teacher locked the door behind her. To distract the class, she began telling stories. 20 minutes passed, and the girl hadn't returned. The teacher began to worry. "Why is she taking so long?" she said aloud. Suddenly, they heard footsteps outside in the hallway. The classroom fell silent. Then a noise came from the door. "Here she is!" The teacher sighed in relief, going to unlock the door. "What if it's not her?" a little boy asked, trembling. The teacher hesitated, her key inches from the lock. The noise at the door came again. "It must be her," she said, inserting the key and turning. The door burst open, revealing a tall man. In his right hand, he held a knife. In his left, the severed head of the little girl. The escaped killer stepped into the classroom, a gruesome grin on his face. The children were trapped. Screams and cries of terror echoed through the school hallways. Amidst the chaos, the teacher managed to break a window and escape, barely saving herself. Some of the children were not so fortunate. When the police arrived, they found the killer sitting in the middle of the blood-soaked classroom, surrounded by small body parts. They found the girl's headless body in the 3rd bathroom stall. They pieced together the horrific events. The convict must have been hiding in the bathroom when the girl entered. He must have forced her to reveal the knocking code before murdering her. The teacher is now in a mental institution never having recovered. The school was abandoned. No one would send their children there after such a tragedy. It remains untouched, a grim monument to the horrific events. They say if you visit the old school and enter that classroom, you can still see blood dripping down the walls. And if you're brave enough to go into the bathroom, knock 3 times and scratch twice on the 3rd stall door. Open it, and you'll find the headless body of the little girl still sitting on the toilet. One evening, a young girl arrived home from school to find the house empty. Her mother had left a sticky note on the refrigerator. It said her father was working the night shift, her mother was shopping, and her younger brothers were at soccer practice. She was alone. As a precaution, she locked the front door. She then placed her cell phone on the living room table, hung her keys on the hook, and went upstairs to her bedroom to change clothes. As she was undressing, she noticed a sticky note on her bed. She picked it up and read the message. "Someone is in the house." Assuming it was her brothers playing a prank, she crumpled up the note and tossed it aside. "Okay, very funny, guys," she said. "What happened?" "Skip soccer practice." Silence. "Hey, I know you're here," she called out. "If I find you messing with my stuff, you're dead." She went downstairs to the kitchen intending to make a snack. Opening the refrigerator, she found another sticky note. "There's no one here but you and me." She dropped the note. "Okay, guys, not funny anymore. Cut it out." Still no reply. She went to the front door and tried the knob. Locked. She went back for her keys, but the hook was empty. Then she looked at the living room table. Her cell phone was gone too. In its place was another sticky note. "You can't escape." She screamed and grabbed the landline phone to call the police. No dial tone. She traced the phone cord and found it cut. Another note lay nearby. No phone, no police, no escape. Trembling with fear, she ran to the back door. She tried the knob. Locked. Another sticky note was stuck to the door. "Look up!" She looked up and saw her pet cat, stabbed through the heart with a kitchen knife, pinned to the ceiling. She shrieked in horror and ran to the nearest window. She punched it, kicked it, but the glass wouldn't break. It didn't even crack. Another note was stuck to the window. "You won't give up, will you?" Terrified, she tried to think. She needed a knife to defend herself. She raced to the kitchen, but when she opened the drawer, it was empty. All the knives were gone, replaced by another sticky note. Children shouldn't play with sharp objects. She ran back upstairs to her bedroom, locked the door, and checked inside the closet and under the bed. No one there. Her TV flickered on, static buzzing. On the screen, she found another sticky note. "Now you're where I want you." She started to panic, screaming, "Help! Help me! Someone help!" Then she remembered her laptop. She found it, opened it, and quickly emailed her best friend. "Help! This isn't a joke! Call the police! There's someone in my house!" Minutes later, she heard sirens. The police arrived and broke down the front door. 2 officers rushed into her bedroom and found her huddled in a corner, shaking with fear. The police searched the entire house from top to bottom, checking every nook and cranny. They found no one. As the officers questioned her about what happened, one of them noticed a sticky note stuck to her back. He peeled it off and handed it to her. It read, "I was this close." Isabella and Cloudy were typical American teenagers. After school, they were inseparable, spending their time watching horror movies, eating, sleeping, and shopping for new clothes. They loved partying, hanging out with friends, having fun, and enjoying life, oblivious to the horrific fate that lay ahead. One night, Isabella and Cloudy decided to have an all-nighter. They planned to sneak out and go to a nightclub after their parents went to bed. Isabella said goodnight to her parents and went upstairs. Once she thought everyone was asleep, she grabbed her cell phone, called Cloudy, and told her to meet her at the corner store down the street. Cloudy agreed and hung up. Isabella quietly opened her bedroom window, careful not to wake anyone. She climbed onto the window ledge and slid down the drainpipe. As she walked down the deserted street, she had an unsettling feeling that she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She glanced behind her, but she was alone. When she reached the corner store, there was no one around, so she pulled out her cell phone and called Cloudy. "Okay, "I'm at the store," she said. "Hurry up or I'm going back." "What's wrong?" Cloudy asked. "I don't know," Isabella replied. "It's not like other nights. Something feels off. I have a bad feeling." "Come on, you're just being paranoid," Cloudy laughed. "I'll be there in 2 minutes. Wait for me." Isabella hung up, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. 5 minutes later, Cloudy arrived, and the two girls headed to the nightclub. As usual, the bouncers never asked for ID, and they went inside. Soon they were dancing to the music and flirting with guys on the dance floor. Around 3 a.m., Isabella was chatting with a cute guy, at least 10 years older than her, when she felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. It was a text message from her ex-boyfriend, Anthony. She hadn't heard from him since they broke up a month ago. The message read, "Come outside. I have a big surprise for you." Curious, Isabella looked around and saw Cloudy busy talking to some other guys. Without saying goodbye, Isabella slipped out of the nightclub. She'd only taken a few steps when she received another text message. "Meet me around the corner by the dumpsters." The street was dimly lit and deserted. Isabella felt a knot in her stomach. Something felt wrong, but she told herself she was being overly cautious. Inside the nightclub, Cloudy was looking for her friend. After 15 minutes of waiting, she was getting impatient. She scanned the dance floor, but there was no sign of Isabella. She even checked the restrooms, but they were empty. At 3:27 a.m., Cloudy was relieved to receive a text message from Isabella. "Meet me outside right now." As Cloudy stepped outside, she received another message. "I'm by the dumpsters. Come see me, babe." Cloudy followed the directions, walking down the dark, desolate street. As she rounded the corner to where the dumpsters were located, a horrifying sight met her eyes. Cloudy's heart stopped. Isabella was hanging upside down from a lamppost in the parking lot behind the dumpsters. Twinkling red and green Christmas lights were wrapped around her ankles. A large pool of blood had formed beneath Isabella. Her body was stripped naked, revealing deep gashes across her stomach and chest. Cloudy collapsed to the ground, screaming hysterically. Some people standing outside the nightclub heard her cries and rushed over. As they rounded the corner and saw Isabella's bloody corpse dangling before them, they were horrified. The police were called, and they questioned Cloudy for hours. She was hysterical, barely able to speak, struggling to control her emotions. She told them how she and Isabella had snuck out together. She tried to remember all the guys they'd flirted with on the dance floor. They asked her if she knew anyone who would want to harm Isabella, but she couldn't think of anyone. As much as she wanted to catch Isabella's killer, she couldn't help the investigation. During the interrogation, one of the police officers pulled out a plastic bag containing a blood-stained envelope. "We found this lodged in Isabella's throat. It's addressed to you," the officer said, handing Cloudy the envelope. The name Cloudy was scrawled across the front. With trembling hands, she pulled out the piece of paper inside and read it. The letter said, "Maybe if you had stayed in bed and gone to sleep like you were supposed to, this wouldn't have happened. Don't sneak out at night. Bad things can happen." The police had to catch her before Cloudy fainted. An ambulance took her to the hospital, where she was treated for shock. When Cloudy returned home the next day, she was still shaken. Her parents told her that Anthony, Isabella's ex-boyfriend, had been arrested for the murder. He was later released after passing a lie detector test. He claimed his phone had been stolen the day of the murder. The police didn't rule him out as a suspect, but they didn't have enough evidence to charge him. As fate would have it, Isabella's murder remained unsolved. The killer was never caught, and over time, people began to forget about the case. 2 years passed, and Cloudy had almost recovered from the horrific night her best friend was brutally murdered. One night, she called her boyfriend and arranged to meet him in the park at 2 a.m. She started walking to the park, but she felt a strange presence, similar to the feeling Isabella had described to her the night she was murdered. Cloudy was almost at the park when the feeling came over her, so she tried to ignore it. Her phone beeped. It was a text message from her boyfriend. "I'm almost there, babe." It made her feel a lot better. The last thing she had to do was walk past the corner store. "The park is just up ahead," she started walking, but then she heard something behind her. Immediately, Cloudy started running. Cloudy's boyfriend arrived at the park and waited for about 15 minutes. At 2:35 a.m., he received a text message from Cloudy. "Just keep walking, and you'll see me." He did as instructed and walked forward. There, hanging upside down from a tree branch, was Cloudy's mutilated body. Christmas lights were again wrapped around her ankles. She was naked and covered in blood. The boyfriend called the police and was questioned throughout the night. The next day, when Cloudy's boyfriend returned home, there was a letter waiting for him on his doorstep. It was stained with small drops of blood. Inside, the letter said, "Don't sneak out at night. Bad things can happen." I wish I could tell you that Isabella and Cloudy's murders were solved, that the vicious killer was found. To this day, the police say the investigation is ongoing, but they haven't had any new leads in a long time. Nowadays, the murders are rarely mentioned. They were high-profile cases at the time, but due to the strangely limited evidence, people soon forgot about them. Everyone involved had to move on with their lives. You might be wondering how I know so much about this story. I don't want to go into it too much because, well, it's still an ongoing investigation. But if you must know, I'm a police officer assigned to the case. I'm the officer who handed Cloudy that blood-stained letter. You might also be wondering why these two murders were never solved. Well, like I always say, don't sneak out at night. Bad things can happen. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. Matthew 7:15. I think a lot about that, saying a lot around this time of year. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. Scary stories, orange and yellow leaves, purple lights and hot apple cider, candy and chilling winds, jack-o'-lanterns and pumpkin spice everything. It's the one time of year you can dress up and hide who you are underneath masks and makeup. Be whatever you want and no one knows who you are. I've loved Halloween since I was a kid. As far back as I can remember, my dad always made such a big deal about the holiday. My mother, not so much. They divorced when I was young, and I've always lived between two households. Typically, I'd be at my dad's during the weekends and my mom's on the weekdays. I'd always pray that Halloween would fall on a weekend so I could be at my dad's house when it happened. He'd always invite my friends over for a big Halloween party. He'd dress up in a scary costume, hand out fun treats, and take me trick-or-treating. My mom, on the other hand, well, she despises the holiday. She's very religious. She's always reading the Bible, lecturing me about this and that. She's got it in her head that Halloween is an evil holiday. She won't have anything to do with it. Not even so much as a harvest festival alternative that some of the local churches around us hold. In fact, she doesn't even go to the churches in our town, and we have a ton of them. She never put up jack-o'-lanterns and not even a hint of fall decor. Not even a be thankful sign for the autumn season or Thanksgiving. My mom is nice enough. She's never been too pushy about her beliefs on me. In fact, she celebrates every other holiday just fine. Christmas, Thanksgiving. She'll even have a beer or two on St. Patrick's Day, but she absolutely has never budged when it comes to Halloween. In fact, she'd make me go to bed really early on Halloween every time I happened to be with her. We've gotten into some very nasty fights over it. I'd be crying and begging her to let me stay up and go trick-or-treating, but she'd always respond that Halloween was evil and that in her house she'd respect the Lord. Then she'd tell me I would just have to get used to it. I once told her I hated her because of it and stormed off to my room, slamming the door. I regret doing that now. I now know she was only trying to protect me. My mom lives several miles away from my dad in a small, rural town with about 3,000 people living there. My dad lives in the city, so when I had Halloween at his place, I'd bring back a huge haul of candy because we had so many neighbors. Everyone got into the holiday spirit on my dad's street. In my mom's neighborhood, everyone there did too. So the stark difference between my mom and the town and mom and my dad has always been really apparent to me. And up until last year, I just had never understood why my mom was such a prude. When I mentioned it to my dad and asked him to make my mom relent, he'd always say, "Your mom has to do things her way, and I'll do things my way. You just have to respect her wishes, buddy." If you look at the calendar, you'll notice Halloween falls on weekdays way more than it falls on weekends. So sadly, I haven't had the experience of being with my dad on Halloween as much as I'd like. I always noticed how much my mom seemed to dread the holiday. She'd be extra into her Bible, praying. Sometimes she'd come up to me and put her hand on me. closing her eyes in prayer, begging God to protect me. Halloween has always been the same at her house. We'd eat dinner around 4 p.m., then she'd usher me off to bed. She wouldn't tolerate me stepping out of my room, and she'd yell at me to sleep if she heard me staying up. I'd always lay in bed, unhappy and frustrated. I'd hear just outside my door, saying the same prayers over and over again. You might be asking why I didn't just sneak out. Well, I would have, except my mom always had the odd habit of boarding up all of our windows, and even our front and back doors. She'd put up a big sign on the front door that said, "Trick or treaters not welcome. At this house, we serve Jesus." She'd hang up crosses and sprinkle the whole house with holy water, even line the front entrance with salt. I always figured my mom was just extra paranoid about things or had gotten it into her head from some televangelist that she needed to be extra scared of spirits and whatnot on Halloween. I've never stayed up very late on Halloween night at my mom's house, with nothing to do but lay in bed. As she usually took all of my toys or devices away, I'd usually fall asleep surprisingly easily. I'd dream about what Halloween could have been and try to get over it the next morning on November 1st. It wasn't until last year I finally found out why my mom is so scared of Halloween. Last year, Halloween fell on a Monday. That year was especially hard for me to accept that I'd be spending yet another fun Halloween night sleeping in early, especially since the year before Halloween had fallen on a Sunday, and my dad had pulled out all the stops. I dreaded having to spend another year in bed early, when for the last 2 years I had been spoiled with Halloween fun. This year was a bit different. I was 17 now, and I felt I could get away with staying up a bit longer, and at the very least being allowed to watch a scary movie. I got to my mom's house earlier that day, as my dad had gotten me out of high school early. When I arrived, the house was drab and normal. No decor, nothing except for wood beams in piles ready to be nailed up. I hugged my dad goodbye, and he told me to behave myself and just do as my mom said, however upset or unhappy it might make me. Great. Another Halloween puritanically wasted. I went up the steps to our house, said hi to my mom, and hugged her. I asked my mom if this year could be different, if maybe I could stay up and watch scary movies. Maybe have some candy. She flat out refused. Absolutely not. Halloween is an evil holiday. You will not have anything to do with it at my house, God help me. I roared with irritation. So unfair. I stomped inside. You're so fucking ridiculous, Mom, I shouted out. I heard her yell about taking the Lord's name in vain. I didn't care. I was so sick of her religious strictness. I needed to get out of the house for a bit. I walked up to the porch where she was standing, apologized for cussing, and asked if I could head down to the store in town for some snacks before we had our early dinner and early bedtime. She sighed. Son, I know you don't understand why I do these things. I know Halloween means so much to you, but it's evil, son. The devil hides in the fun things. Halloween is evil. I wish I could get you to understand. She said it would be okay, but to be home no later than 3 p.m. She was dead serious. I didn't want to find out the fit my mom would have if I didn't stick to her curfew. I walked off towards the main area of town with all the small businesses. My mom luckily didn't live too far from the general store, only 4 or 5 blocks away. I got to the store and was looking at some of the hot Cheetos when a priest came up to me. I glanced over and he said hello. Hi there. Need anything? I asked. I'm sorry to bother you, but I noticed you weren't dressed up. The priest said, his hands clasped in a pious manner. I was supposing perhaps you weren't participating in any of the festivities this evening. I was wondering if perhaps you would like to attend my church's Harvest Festival party. There will be candy and even a costume party. I already knew what my mom would say if I asked, so I gently sighed and responded. That's really nice of you, but I actually have other plans tonight, sadly. I'm sorry. The priest smiled and said that was quite all right. He bid me goodbye and told me he wished the Lord would bless me. He walked off and I took my chips to the register. I walked back home and sulked. My mom wouldn't have ever allowed it, even if it was at a church. She'd say that it was just another form of Halloween, and that it was evil, and that it was out of the question. I couldn't wait to turn 18 and be out on my own, make my own plans, celebrate Halloween the way I wanted to. I just didn't understand. To me, Halloween wasn't evil, or even unchristian for that matter. Sure, it dealt with death and ghosts and ghouls, but it was mostly about fun for me. Costumes, candy, maybe even some sexy times or partying. It wasn't about anything bad. In some ways, Halloween helped us laugh at death. It was the one time of year death wasn't so scary, so horrible. Wasn't there a saying my mom once told me? Something like, "Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting?" If anything, Halloween perhaps could help Christians live out that reality. But my mom would never understand that. I went up to the house, trudged in, and ate my snacks while watching my mom start to nail the doors and windows shut. There was no more going out tonight. She was soon done, and the doors and windows were locked, her sign fluttering on the door, making knocking sounds every time the wind came and hit the wood. Then she made a quick pasta dinner. I ate it in silence, making it known my displeasure. My mother ate in silence as well, looking at the boarded windows nervously. Then she checked her watch. "It's 4 p.m., son. Finish up and get to bed." I sighed. I ate as slowly as I could. Every passing moment, my mother seemed to get more and more nervous. I had a few bites left of my meal, but my mom suddenly shot up and shooed me away from the table. "That's enough for now. You need to get to your room. Go." I rolled my eyes and walked to my room. My mom closed the door behind me. I looked around my room. I looked at my bedroom window, boarded up with wood. I could see between the slits in the wood. I could see the neighbor's house and the orange and red trees. The sun was still up. I sighed yet again, filled with annoyance. I plopped down on my bed. My mom had taken my phone. There was no TV, no books, nothing to do but try to get to sleep. I stared up at the ceiling in my room. I heard my mother walk up outside my bedroom door, starting to pray. "The blood of Jesus protect us tonight. Father God, protect us tonight. Amen." I just couldn't stand it anymore. I furrowed my brow in anger. I was 17, damn it. I wasn't following my mom's lame rules anymore. I made up my mind. Tonight, whether she liked it or not, I was getting up out of my room and doing something Halloween-related. I was going to watch Child's Play. Or Scream. If I couldn't leave the house, I could at least watch the kids trick or treating nearby. I decided I'd wait until after my mom was done praying and had gone to bed herself to sneak out of my room. I listened to her praying. "Jesus, have mercy. Lord, protect us from evil. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us." I lay there listening to her pray for about an hour. I glanced over at my alarm clock. It was about 6 p.m. by the time she finally finished. I heard her walk off and gently close her bedroom door. I couldn't get out of bed just yet. I needed to wait until I was sure she was asleep. I sat up in bed and looked out of the cracks in between the boards. The sun was rapidly going down. Yet oddly, there weren't any trick-or-treaters out quite yet. I waited, watching the sky grow ever darker, until I was sure my mom was asleep. It was about 7:45 p.m. The sun was mostly down at this point. Only a slight yellowish glow remained on the horizon. I went up to my bedroom door. I slowly, ever so slowly, turned the knob. I managed to turn it without so much as a sound, and then I gently pulled the door open. It made a slight squeak, and I winced as it did so. Nothing. My mom hadn't heard. Thank God. I pulled open even more, just enough so I could squeeze my body through, and I could get out into the hallway. I did so, and I glanced down the hall at my mom's room. I could hear her gently snoring. I tiptoed to the living room. I went to the couch and sat down, picking up the remote. I turned on the lamp on the side table near me and selected a streaming service on the TV. Scream, here I come. I turned the volume down as low as I could. I looked up at the clock on the side of the living room wall. It had just turned 8 o'clock. Some preview for a show I didn't care about was playing when suddenly the power went out. I sat up, confused. The lamp was out. I tried to turn it on again, but nothing. I glanced outside between the gaps in the boards on the window. The streetlights were out. Even the lights from the Halloween decor of our neighbors was dark. I watched as the sky grew darker and darker. Perhaps there had been a power surge, but the weather wasn't bad. It had been a perfect, cloudless day. I sat there, perplexed. Then I finally saw something. It was a gentle orange glow. At first, I didn't see what it was. But as I kept looking, I eventually saw a small group of children dressed in Halloween costumes. They held torches in their hands. They had potato sacks to collect candy clutched at their sides. They walked up the street slowly like zombies. Then another group came. Each of the kids had a mask on. Some were clowns, some were animals, some were skulls or demon faces, but not a single child had their face exposed. Group after group came down the street, silent as the grave. Then I saw more groups. This time, they were made up of what I could only assume were adults. They were far taller and fatter in many cases. Some were holding the hands of little ones. They had masks on too. On had a cartoon cat's mask on. Another had a Guy Fawkes mask. Yet another had what I could only describe as a voodoo mask. They all held torches, lighting their way as the sky finally became devoid of sunlight and pitch black. The torches cast shadows on the neighborhood and the houses, the haunting orange glow reflecting and amplified by the orange of the leaves on the trees and ground. Many people clearly were traveling as families. I saw groups of 5, sometimes 10. Silently, they went up the street. Then I saw one man sum up. He had a special mask on. It was a large black mask with 3 skulls, presumably human, in a triangle formation on the black background. 2 on the bottom, 1 skull on top. He held a torch and an enormous knife with a red hilt. He stopped in the middle of the street and shouted something. Whatever he said, it made the groups of people stop and turn around to face him. He used the hand that had the knife and yelled something, pointing it towards the houses around him. Then he walked on. He was out of sight, and I wanted a better look at what was going on. I crawled up to the window and pressed my eye against the glass, looking through the gaps in the boards. I could see much more now. The little children had circled back around. They went up to the houses nearby and knocked on the doors. They then stood there waiting for someone to answer. I watched as one of my neighbors, a sweet, blonde-haired lady, opened the door with a smile, holding an orange bowl of Snickers. She was about to say something and comment on the kids' costumes, but looked at the kids in wonder. They held their torches and stood there, not even saying the customary trick or treat. The lady laughed nervously and asked if they wanted some candy. "Boy, you guys are really scary." "You definitely win that award," she commented, trying to hand one of the kids with a green witch's mask a candy bar. The kid didn't accept it, but instead pointed at her. One of the adults came up to the porch, briskly walking over. The woman's eyes widened and she screamed as the adult roughly took her by arms and dragged her to the street. Her husband came out yelling at the adult to let her go, but 3 other masked adults came out and wrestled him to the ground. They then tied up both people, kicking and screaming. I couldn't believe my eyes. Some of my neighbors looked outside of their doors to see what was happening, only for them to be snatched up next. The children led the way as the adults brought crying and screaming people down the street. I watched on of my neighbors' houses open up, only for a few people I presumed were my neighbors to walk out with masks on, holding their kids' hands behind them, also in masks, to join in the activity. The same thing happened over and over again. The kids would go up to a door, they'd knock, and someone would answer. Then they'd be attacked, tied up, and dragged away to join others. I watched as they headed toward the direction of the main area of town, where all the shops and businesses were at. I listened as people begged to be let go, men cursing and demanding the reason for all of this. A woman screamed as a masked man got up close to her, grabbed her by the hair and stroked her face with a gloved hand. I watched as more groups of masked people came, dragging teenagers and children with them, on a cart. They were all crammed into a cage, some crying, others yelling similar things to the adults. I looked at their wrists and saw they had orange bands. I couldn't read what was on them, but the same symbol as the one found outside on the local Catholic church was on them. More teenagers came, literally by the cartful, crammed into tiny cages with at least a dozen others. I heard wailing and screaming. I watched as they all headed to the main part of town. Then I watched as the children went out into the woods with their parents, leaving the masses of people, about 200 of them, sitting in the street to be watched by the skull man with the knife, and a few other large masked men with other weapons and torches. They struggled against their ties and the caged youth tried futilely to move. I shuddered as I watched orange lights dive in and out of the trees. The flames on their torches dimmed and flickered in the slight wind outside, making their disappearing sparks look like flashing Halloween lights and will-o'-the-wisps. It was pitch black outside except for the flames. The power was still not back on. As much as I wanted to crawl back into bed, I couldn't tear myself away from the strange events happening outside. I had to keep watching. The children came out of the woods, dragging large branches of wood behind them. They began to pile them up in the center of town until they had built a huge pile of them. A mountain of wood was formed, and then all of the masked people got into a large group in front of the skull man with the knife. The man held his hand up with the knife and handed his torch to a man with a goat mask on. There were so many of them. The skull man spoke. "People, it is that time of year again. All Hallows Eve is upon us once more. Let us remember our commitments. Our Father awaits us. They await us. Let us celebrate." My eyes widened, and my heart jumped into my throat upon hearing his voice. His voice was the same as the priest I had spoken to earlier that day at the grocery store. A cheer rang out from the masked crowd who clapped their hands. The priest in the skull mask held out his hand, and a man in a gorilla mask brought the blonde neighbor of mine up in front of him. Her face was stained with mascara as she cried, begging, asking what was happening and why they were doing this. The skull-masked man held her by her hair and brought her throat up to his knife. The children in mask went to the front of the crowd and waited expectantly. The priest made a shout and slit the blonde's throat. Immediately, blood gushed forth, and her screams turned into gurgling. Her warm blood splattered on the ground, and a man in a Michael Myers mask came up with a golden chalice that had a pentagram on it to collect the blood. Then the man in the skull mask took his knife and began to hack away at the blonde's body. The little kids held out their potato sacks, and the priest dropped pieces of her body into each of them. A bloody lock of hair went into the bag of a girl with a Princess Peach mask, a fingertip into the bag of a boy with the Optimus Prime mask. One girl with a bunny mask on cried with glee as an eyeball was tossed casually into her bag. I watched helpless as she was dolled out like some kind of sick treat to the children. I watched as they danced gleefully around the screaming cages of teenagers. The adults went to the great pile of wood and began to pour gasoline on it. One adult in an Iron Man mask lit the pile, and it burst into flames as a great bonfire. The light from the fire was intense, and the air shimmered with heat. My eyes began to well up with tears at the atrocity being committed in front of me. The adults started to drag their tied-up victims toward the fire. Then they lifted them up and tossed them alive onto the blazing pyre. I closed my eyes and covered my ears as they screamed in agony. I started to hear a chant being sung. I peeked up to watch from my window. The goblet of blood was being passed around to the people, who lifted their masks to reveal their lips and to take a sip of the freshly shed blood. The chanting got louder with every person they threw into the flames. They repeated it over and over again. I can still remember the words. Obscura patris excepta nostroque innocens sacrificio. Sanguis este nobis de potestatem. Pater mendaci da nobis de sideria cordis nostris. Da nobis omnes gentes dominari. Intentationem potios indugnos. They chanted it over and over again. I wasn't sure how they were even able to chant loud enough to drown out the sounds of screaming people being burned alive. The children danced around the bonfire like demonic imps. I watched as an adult in a medieval plague mask began to look towards my house from far away. He walked away from the group towards my house. I watched as he got closer. 4 blocks away, 3 blocks away, 2 blocks away. Soon he was but 100 feet from my yard. I wanted to hide. I wanted to duck, but I frozen still in horror. Suddenly someone's hand grabbed me from behind. I let out a scream that was quickly covered by a hand, which silenced me. I looked back. It was my mother. She ducked us both down beneath the window. She went up to my ear and whispered, "What on earth are you doing out of bed?" We both looked up as a shadowy figure got up to the window. The figure stood there, illuminated from behind by the yellow-orange of the town bonfire. We sat there frozen, not saying a word, until the figure slowly moved away from the window. We sat there a while longer until we were sure he was gone. "My son," my mother whispered, "get to bed. And do not get out. Do not look out of the windows. Lay there until sunrise." I got up and did as I was told. I shut my door and got into bed. I tried to ignore the orange glow shining in from my window. I tried to ignore the chants. They had gotten louder. I tried to ignore it when I heard metal being dragged and teenagers screaming blood murder as they were tossed on the fire, trapped together in their metal cage. I tried not to listen as their flesh crackled and popped and as their screams turned into whimpers. I tried to ignore the laughter of the children most of all. I listened as another person had their throats slit, as adults under masks sipped their blood like wine, like some kind of demented communion. I listened as women moaned and men slammed into them, like the applause of a concert. Their screams of pleasure echoed by the screams of agony. I listened as my mother stood outside my room praying fervently, "The blood of Jesus cover us. The blood of Jesus cover us." I listened as the chants outside turned into one repeated phrase repeated over and over again. Avai Satanas, Avai Satanas. I could hear both the young and old chant it. It lasted all night. The same chant over and over again. More screams, more giggling, more sounds of bodies cut up and given to the children as treats. Avai Satanas, Avai Satanas. Somehow, at some point, I fell asleep. I awoke to my mother on my bed stroking my face. I asked her if what I saw last night is real. She said yes. Halloween is an evil holiday. I asked many questions. Why did she live here? Why didn't she call the cops? Why did this happen? My mom explained that the town was ran by a satanic cult. She couldn't be sure who was or wasn't a part of it. She had tried to call the cops one year, but without power, they couldn't be reached. And when she reported it to the local police, they had taken her report but had done nothing about it. When she tried another department further away, they didn't believe her report. She had tried to get proof, but no one was willing to see it. They all just thought she was a crazy Christian lady. "Why didn't you warn the neighbors?" I asked, crying. "I did. They didn't believe me," she said, tears flowing from her own eyes. "I knew you'd never believe me either if I had told you. Besides, who wants to tell their child something so terrible?" I asked why she didn't keep me with my father every Halloween. She replied that she had to have me on weekends, per court order, that she had told my dad once, but he called her liar. He was too interested in having his own fun every few years, and he insisted I be with her, that she was making it all up. "No one thinks this stuff can happen," she said, "and no one believes people when they see it firsthand." I asked her why she had never moved far from the town to get away. "For one, I'm sure they'd stop me," she said, "and secondly, I cannot abandon the people of this town who don't know. I must warn them. I must do the work of the Lord." I then asked why they didn't come for us. "They would in a heartbeat, but they, for some reason, will only come for you if you invite them in, if you leave your doors and windows unlocked, if you talk to them, if they see you. I make it clear I'm not celebrating and that they can't come in, and I board the windows so they won't break in. They seem to hate anything to do with the cross, and they aren't too fond of salt." I went out that day after we had taken down the boards. I looked over at the town center. There was no evidence at all of the horrors of last night. They must have cleaned it all up somehow. I would have thought it all a bad nightmare if it wasn't for the distinct char on the asphalt, barely distinguishable unless you knew where to look, and the scraps of potato sack in the bushes around town. I'm 18 this year, a high school senior. This year Halloween falls on a Tuesday, so I'll be with my mom again. I told my dad I didn't want to go. I told him about what I had seen last year. He yelled at me and called me a liar. He doesn't believe me either. No one new to the town does. We managed to get a few more people to board up their places. But it's not enough to save them all. That's my story. I'm partially writing it to warn all of you reading. Halloween for most people is an innocent, fun, spooky holiday. For some, it's a pagan holiday used to celebrate the dead and to connect to the spirit realm. To a few, it's simply a harvest festival. For others, it's an evil, evil holiday. And you never know who considers it so. You never know who underneath those innocent masks is in fact a ravenous wolf seeking to make you the next sacrifice to untold, incomprehensible, hellish evils. I've got to get going. I got to help my mother pick up some new wooden boards at Home Depot. Halloween is coming in a week or two, and it's going to be here soon. One last thing before I go. I have a request to ask those of you who are reading. Pray for us. Pray that we will make it through another year of Halloween.